We'll be able to hold about 5 minutes. That's all we can do.
This aircraft is battering rain and howling winds on its way into New York, which in itself is nothing special. But the pilots on board are flying with a huge knot in their stomachs, because the situation that they are now in is anything but normal. Stay tuned. The airspace around New York City is some of the busiest and most complex in the world. With 3 major international airports within just a few miles from each other and then 35 further smaller airports in the surrounding area, the system has been developed to keep air traffic flowing efficiently and safely into the region, making it essentially the 8th wonder of the world. In fact, this system works so extraordinarily well that hardly anything ever goes wrong, hardly ever. The crew and passengers of Avianca Flight 052 on a wintry day back in 1990 had no idea that they were about to become the exception to that rule. Avianca is the flag carrier of Colombia and the second oldest continuously operating airline in the world after the Dutch KLM. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, Avianca operated a fleet consisting of 3 Boeing models, with the 747 handling long-haul flights, the 727 for short-haul, and for the mid-range routes they used the by then already antiquated Boeing 707. The 4-engine narrow-body 707 was the first really successful American jetliner when it entered service back in 1958, which I've actually covered over on my second channel, Mentour Now. But while the 707 was revolutionary when it came out, by 1990 it was considered a bit of a dinosaur. Avianca operated the 707-320 Charlie, which was the longest range version with a range of more than 6,000 nautical miles. And this made it ideal for Avianca's 4 times daily direct service from Colombia to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. Out of these flights, 3 went from Bogotá and 1 from Medellin, and that one, the one from Medellin, had flight number 052. On the afternoon of the 25th of January 1990, 3 pilots and 6 cabin crew were therefore preparing their 707 for takeoff from Medellin, following a short 1-hour hop from Bogotá. In command of the flight was a 51-year-old captain who had been flying for Avianca since 1962, during which time he had accrued a wide selection of type ratings and 16,787 hours of flying time, including about 1,500 on the 707. The first officer was 28 years old and had a total of 1,837 hours, of which just 64 were on the 707, so there was quite a seniority difference between the two. In fact, the captain had joined Avianca only 3 months after the first officer was born. And then last but not least, the third flight crew member was a 45-year-old flight engineer who was actually the most experienced on the type, with 10,134 total hours, including 3,000 on the 707. Now, none of the flight crew members had any record of any training difficulties, but by modern standards the quality of the training itself back then would have been considered quite antiquated. In 1990, Avianca, for example, did not yet instruct its crews in the principles of CRM, crew resource management, which is the set of strategies that we pilots use to ensure that we're making proper use of every crew member's knowledge, opinions and awareness. On top of that, there were also some issues with the English language proficiency among many of the pilots at Avianca. And apparently the captain of this flight didn't speak enough English to feel comfortable talking to American air traffic controllers, which is something that would soon end up playing a role here. Anyway, back at the aircraft, since this was an en route stop, the pilots wouldn't have needed to review the technical log, since they had already done that when they started their duty back in Bogotá. But they knew from that previous flight that this 22-year-old airplane had a number of potentially significant deferred technical issues. Most significantly, the autopilot was placarded as inoperative, which in itself isn't really a problem. We pilots are perfectly capable of hand-flying the aircraft if needed, but this did mean that the workload during the flight would be higher than normal, especially on a really long flight like this one. In addition to that, the previous flight crew had also reported that the flight directors weren't working properly when used in approach mode. The flight director is an overlay on the primary flight displays that instructs the pilots how to fly in order to achieve a specific desired flight path. For example, when performing a manual instrument approach, the flight director can be set to the approach mode in order to help the pilot follow the glide path and localize the signals from the instrument landing system. Now, with no autopilot and no flight director working in approach mode, an ILS approach would instead have to be flown using what we call raw data. And that means that the pilot has to maintain course and path only with reference to a pair of crude deviation indicators showing roughly the distance between the plane and the glide slope and localizer. Now, flying an ILS approach in raw data is something that we rarely do because it increases the workload a lot, and therefore also the difficulty. Anyway, back in Medellin, the cabin crew helped board the last few passengers, bringing the total number of passengers up to 149, plus the 9 crew members. And whilst the cabin crew were doing that, the flight crew received the dispatch paperwork and the flight plan from the Avianca dispatcher. This flight plan listed Boston as their alternate airport in case they couldn't land at JFK, and it also included a breakdown of the required fuel load for the trip. The requirement used by Avianca stated that the flight had to have enough fuel to taxi to the runway, take off, then fly to its destination, make a missed approach there, then fly to Boston, hold for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet, and then land. All this plus reserve fuel equal to 10% of the total flight time between Medellin and New York. This meant that for the 4-hour and 40-minute flight to New York, a minimum of 6 hours and 8 minutes of fuel was actually required, and that's about 73,930 pounds. And also, to add an extra safety margin, Avianca company policy was to add more fuel above the minimum until the aircraft reached its maximum takeoff weight for the intended takeoff runway. So with a planned takeoff from runway 36 at Medellin, the flight crew were able to uplift a total of 82,000 pounds of fuel, of which 1,500 would be burned during taxi, bringing the aircraft down to its maximum takeoff weight. So as far as the flight crew were concerned, they had taken on quite a lot more fuel than required, so they likely thought that they would be more than ready for any type of contingency that they might encounter. But having said that, they actually had no idea of the true severity of the situation that was now developing over at their destination. Now, before we dive deeper into this story, I want to take a moment to talk about something that I find a bit frustrating. You see, my work takes me all over the world, so whether it's for this channel, as a pilot or on vacation, travel is a big part of my life. Now, as some of you might know, I'm also a huge hockey fan, and streaming games is challenging on the go when my streaming services are geo-locked to my home. And I also have a feeling that some of you might be interested in watching the racing season that has just started.
The time is now.
So that's where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes to the rescue. With servers in over 60 different countries, NordVPN generally allows me to watch games live from around the world and keep track of my favorite team in real time. No more sketchy streams, waiting for recaps or dodging spoilers. But NordVPN isn't just about streaming. Researching aviation incidents also means digging through various sites in the deep, dark corners of the internet. And NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro now includes a search safety indicator, helping me identify potentially unsafe websites. That's a big help in preventing malicious websites from accessing my personal data, which gives me peace of mind while researching. Now, today, Nord has a fantastic offer for you, my viewers out there. If you sign up for their 2-year plan using the link in the description below or this QR code up here, you'll get 4 extra months for free, and you'll also get to directly support this channel. And on top of that, their 30-day money-back guarantee also means that there is no real risk in trying them out. Thank you, Nord, for supporting our work. Now, let's get back to the story. You see, on that day, a large low-pressure system was positioned over the entire northeastern United States, generating low overcast, fog, precipitation, and high winds all the way up the eastern seaboard to Canada and inland all the way to Chicago and beyond. With conditions expected to get even worse later in the day, Federal Aviation Administration specialists at the Central Flow Control Facility in Washington, D.C. had begun discussing how to handle the situation early that morning, long before Avianca Flight 052 even departed from Medellin. The Central Flow Control Facility, or Flow Control for short, is the nerve center of America's air traffic network, determining how US airspace is used on a macro level. Flow control's primary job is to ensure that demand matches capacity at major US airports in real time as conditions fluctuate. Now, during periods of bad weather, the number of airplanes that an airport can accept decreases, since low visibility might prevent some runways from being used, or high winds might force controllers to use increased spacing between all of the aircraft on approach. And this means that the number of flights en route towards that airport also has to decrease, or some of them won't be able to land, and that's where flow control steps in. When a major airport's capacity is reduced, Flow Control institutes what's known as a program in order to respond. And one way to do this is by ordering a ground hold for aircraft bound for the affected airport, delaying those aircraft from departing so that the capacity at their destination isn't exceeded. Now, for passengers, these delays can be very frustrating, but it's much better to hold aircraft on the ground than to cause en route delays or even diversions. On the day of this story, Flow Control was aware from an early stage that restrictive programs would probably have to be put in place for the entire New York area, because conditions later in the day were expected to fall below landing minimums at the region's major airports, including JFK. But to understand how this affected the story of Flight 052, we also need to explain how the air traffic control system in the New York area is structured. At the upper levels, the entire United States is subdivided into 22 different sectors, each governed by an Air Route Traffic Control Center, or ARTCC. The New York ARTCC controls traffic over New York City and Long Island, as well as parts of several neighboring states, and it's bordered by the Boston ARTCC to the north and the Washington ARTCC to the south. If an aircraft is headed towards an airport within the New York ARTCC, then midway through its descent, it will be handed over to an intermediate control facility known as the TRACON. The TRACON's job is to take aircraft descending out of the upper level airspace and then funnel them into a spider web of designated approach corridors to each of the 38 New York area airports, which at that time included Newark, JFK, and LaGuardia. Now, the TRACON also handles aircraft departing from those airports and places them within departure corridors that keeps them away from the approach corridors. Once an aircraft is established on an approach into an airport, the TRACON will then hand over the control to the third and final stage, which is the Air Traffic Control Tower. And for aircraft inbound to JFK, Kennedy Tower will take over from the TRACON only for the last few minutes of each flight, basically just long enough to clear them to land. Anyway, for flow control purposes, the tower supervisors at each major New York airport typically report their estimated capacity to the TRACON flow control specialist, who then coordinates the acceptance rates with the central flow control facility. So, for example, if flow control is aware that 40 aircraft bound for JFK are scheduled to arrive during a particular hour, and the tower expects that their acceptance rate during that period will be only 35 aircraft per hour, well then, flow control can match demand to capacity by telling, let's say, Chicago to delay takeoff for 5 JFK-bound flights by 1 hour. But US flow control only has the authority to issue ground holds for aircraft departing from the United States, not from aircraft arriving from overseas, which is worth remembering. Now, on the morning when this story took place, the TRACON specialist reported to Flow Control that the forecasted weather conditions would likely result in an acceptance rate at JFK as low as 28 planes per hour. But Flow Control wanted an acceptance rate of 32 planes per hour because more than 50 New York-bound flights from Europe had already taken off and would arrive to JFK during the afternoon, and those aircraft would need to land no matter what. What this meant was that if the acceptance rate was too low, well then most domestic flights would have to be held on the ground for long periods while the backlog of international flight was cleared out, and Flow Control wanted to avoid that if possible. Despite the TRACON specialist's warnings, the central flow control specialist in charge of the New York program therefore decided that the program would assume an acceptance rate at JFK of 33 aircraft per hour. The specialist explained that at a rate of 33 per hour, the average ground delay for JFK-bound domestic flights would be 2 hours and 13 minutes, and that would increase to 3 hours and 10 minutes if the acceptance rate was reduced to 30. 28 was completely off the table. Now, when the TRACON specialist protested this, Flow Control replied, "Well, you're not going to get that, but I really can't put 3-hour ground delays out. So essentially, what flow control did here was to knowingly release more JFK-bound aircraft than the airport was expected to be able to handle. This with the understanding that some of those flights would have to enter lengthy airborne holds or even divert to alternate airports. Now, this was probably done because 3-hour ground holds would force airlines to start cancelling flights, causing a travel chaos to spread throughout the country. And as we will soon see, this decision would soon have unforeseen consequences. As the day progressed, the weather in New York then got progressively worse, and the controllers therefore, as expected, struggled to achieve the planned acceptance rate of 33 aircraft per hour. By the time Avianca Flight 052 departed Medellin at 15:08, the TRACON specialist had already warned flow control numerous times that the program wasn't working and that airplanes were now entering airborne holds waiting for their turn to land. And then, at 1600, the weather in New York rapidly deteriorated even further. Up until that point, aircraft had been landing on JFK's parallel runways 22 right and 22 left, but now the visibility had fallen below the minimums for 22 right, bringing the airport down to only one usable runway. Now, this sudden deterioration had been predicted by the forecast, but the timing of this turned out to be completely wrong, with the bad weather arriving 4 hours early. So it now became imperative for the Central Flow Control Facility to reduce the planned acceptance rate and issue a widespread ground stop for New York-bound travel. But that unfortunately didn't happen. So as aircraft continued to depart for New York, the airborne traffic jam now worsened, and by 16:30 there were 39 aircraft waiting to land at JFK, while the actual number of landings per hour had fallen down to below 30. By 1800, the New York ARTCC was so full that many aircraft were holding in the neighboring Washington ARTCC as well, and some flights were also forced to divert to alternate airports. And as this was happening, Avianca Flight 052 had taken off and was now heading north straight towards this escalating traffic nightmare, with the pilots on board likely having no idea about it. You see, normally, when bad weather and delays are expected, we pilots are in constant contact with our company or other resources to get the latest information about the air traffic situation, weather, and also to plan for contingencies. We're even sometimes making requests to air traffic control for the latest weather conditions in order to keep our situational awareness up to date. But on Avianca Flight 052, none of that seemed to have happened. And to understand why, we need to talk a little bit more about how this flight had been dispatched to begin with. You see, a major issue here seemed to have been that the pilots of Flight 052 had been given weather forecasts that were already 9 to 10 hours out of date. This meant that the forecast for JFK gave a visibility of 1 mile in rain with overcast at 800 feet and winds gusting up to 30 knots, quite poor but still above minimums. The forecast for their alternate airport, Boston, was even worse, indicating 3/4 of a mile visibility in rain, overcast clouds at 500 feet and winds gusting up to 25 knots. And knowing that, you might already be wondering why Boston was selected as an alternate at all, and that's a really good question. It turns out that the contractor who drafted Avianca's flight plans used a computer system that automatically entered Boston as the alternate airport for every flight to JFK, without actually checking what the weather was like. And Avianca's dispatchers then didn't cross-check if the alternate was appropriate or not. Now, Avianca's own procedures require that the alternate airport should have at least 1,000-foot cloud ceiling and 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles of visibility, which was clearly not met in this case. Now, to be perfectly honest here, the pilots should have caught this when they checked the dispatch paperwork, because making sure that we have a suitable alternate airport is a really important part of our pre-flight duties. But overall, it seems like everyone in this scenario was just going through the motions, so this important question was never even raised. If the pilots would have noticed the poor weather, they could have easily changed the alternate to Buffalo or Syracuse instead, which did meet the weather requirements, but that never happened. Now, on top of this, the pilots could and should have requested updated weather information whilst en route, but for some almost inexplicable reason they didn't do that either. Investigators later reviewed communications with Avianca Dispatch and every air traffic control facility along the flight's route, but there was no record anywhere of any request for the latest weather in JFK made by the flight. Now, we don't know why the crew never performed this crucial part of their duties, but there might have been an element of complacency involved. And that could also explain why the flight crew never asked about the traffic situation in New York either. You see, Avianca had a contract with a dispatch center in Miami that the crew could have called to request this information, but they never did that either. And according to dispatchers who worked there, they rarely heard from any Avianca crew at all. This could suggest that the culture at Avianca was not really encouraging pilots to be very assertive and to take control of their own circumstances, and that is something that we're going to see again as this story continues. Anyway, for several hours, Flight 052 therefore continued uneventfully northward. Eventually, they passed through the Miami, Jacksonville and finally Washington ARTCC, which is where they suddenly run into the back of the massive queue inbound to JFK. At time 1904, the Washington ARTCC placed Flight 052 into a holding pattern over Norfolk, Virginia, a full 250 nautical miles south of the destination. And that was because not only were all the holding points in the New York ARTCC area already full, but so were the northern holdings in the Washington sector as well. After holding over Norfolk for 19 minutes, Flight 052 was eventually cleared to continue to the Bolton intersection near Atlantic City, New Jersey, where Washington ARTCC put them into a second holding pattern at time 1943 in order to await space to open up in the New York sector. During this period, the pilots were cleared several times to descend, which likely kept up the impression that they were at least making some progress. But at time 20:09, after holding at Atlantic City for 26 minutes, the first officer finally asked Washington for information about any delays into Boston. And this was the first indication that the flight crew was maybe starting to be a little bit concerned about their situation. The cockpit voice recorder unfortunately only captured the last 40 minutes of the flight, so we don't know what the crew were discussing at this point or whether they were actually discussing to divert. But in any case, in response, the Washington controller stated that Boston was open and accepting flights and that they now could expect an additional 30 minutes of holding in New York airspace for JFK. At this point, Flight 052 had already been holding for 45 minutes, which is quite a long time, so 30 more minutes on top of that should have definitely started to raise some alarm bells about their fuel state. Now, of course, things weren't quite the same back in 1990, but the way that we do things today is that we, as a crew, will agree on a minimum diversion fuel level. And if we predict that we will start to get close to that diversion fuel level before we start our approach, then we might decide to divert right away, even before attempting an approach to our destination, especially if the weather is bad. We can also decide to commit to the destination and use our diversion fuel for holding, but only if the weather and situation is so good that a landing is highly likely. Now, calculating the expected fuel levels at any different point, including the diversion fuel required, would nowadays be done using the flight management computer. But on Avianca's 707s, it would instead been the job of the flight engineer to do that. But there is absolutely no evidence that this was being done in this flight at all. Now, if a diversion fuel level isn't established, well, then you run the risk of letting yourself wait too long at your destination, and if the weather then turns out to be terrible, you might find yourself painted into a corner with no way out. At time 2012, Washington ARTCC cleared Flight 052 to continue north into the New York ARTCC, where they were subsequently cleared to the Cameron intersection, 39 miles south of JFK. Cameron was the point where JFK-bound aircraft were normally handed over from the ARTCC to the TRACON, but on that day, because there were more aircraft in the airspace than the airport could handle, aircraft were instead stacked up in holding patterns over Cameron at multiple flight levels. Now, because the TRACON's job is to sequence aircraft for approach, they don't hold aircraft in their airspace. Instead, they only accept a new aircraft when space has opened up in the landing queue. And the TRACON also has to keep a certain distance between aircraft in the approach corridor so that flights don't start catching up with each other when the plane in front starts to slow down for the approach. On this day, there was also a strong wind from the south, which meant that aircraft inbound from the south would have a strong tailwind at first until they turned around to approach runway 22 left, at which point that tailwind would become a headwind, resulting in a huge reduction in ground speed. So because of this, bigger separation was also required in the initial approach corridor, extending the delays even further. This meant that when Avianca Flight 052 finally arrived over Cameron, they were now the last ones in line to be fed into the TRACON. And when you have, let's say, 8 airplanes ahead of you and it takes each of them 5 minutes to cover the separation distance before the next plane can leave the hold, well then you're looking at a minimum of 40 minutes delay. All of that was apparent to the TRACON controllers, but not so much to the Avianca crew, who seemed to have really had no idea of just how bad these delays actually were. At time 2018, when Flight 052 arrived over Cameron, flying at 14,000 feet, the New York ARTCC told the crew to expect further clearance at time 2030, meaning in about 12 minutes. Now, most likely the flight crew believed that this was the time at which they would finally be cleared for the approach, but that was not what an expect further clearance time actually meant. In fact, the controller had no idea when Flight 052 would be cleared for approach, but they did expect to clear them to descend further at 2030. It's likely that the Avianca crew did not understand this, and later Colombian investigators pointed out that if an expect further clearance or EFC time doesn't refer to the time when the plane will be cleared for approach, then what was the point of that EFC at all? And I kind of agree with that. In fact, that's likely why we don't use EFCs anymore. Instead, controllers today only give us an expected approach time, or if that time is unknown, they will say something like indefinite or undetermined holding. Now, if at this stage the crew of Flight 052 had been told to expect indefinite holding, they might have decided to just divert immediately towards their alternate, or at least to start making some type of contingency plans. But now that didn't happen. And if the pilots would have requested the latest information about the conditions at JFK, they would have learned that the weather was now way worse than expected. In fact, it had a visibility hovering right around their landing minimums, and it was combined with strong winds and rain. In fact, at time 2035, JFK informed flow control that 20% of all flights that attempted to approach runway 22 left had been forced to go around due to low visibility. So this was definitely not the time to commit to that specific airport. But here it seems like the pilots fell into the trap of believing that an approach to JFK was right around the corner, and that once they were cleared for the approach, all of their problems would be solved. As their first EFC time of 2030 approached, the controller provided a new EFC time of 2039, while also clearing the flight to descend down to 11,000 feet. Now, the crew accepted this without a protest, probably figuring that they could still wait 9 minutes more, and besides, they were being given further clearances, so clearly they were making progress, right? Well, time 2039 came and went, with no further clearances issued. It was around this time that the flight crew probably started to become really concerned about their fuel state, when in reality they should have been thinking about this for at least an hour at this point. They had now been holding at 3 different locations for a total of 1 hour and 9 minutes, and that meant that they had used up all of the fuel for the en route portion, plus most of the contingency fuel and diversion fuel that they had on board. In fact, just to land at JFK would now require them to dip into their final reserve fuel, which is never supposed to be used except for in a real emergency. Today, if our calculations show that we're going to have to use any of that reserve fuel, we must immediately declare an emergency to air traffic control using the phrase "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, fuel." By doing that, we unambiguously tell air traffic control that we need to move every single other aircraft out of our way so that we can land immediately. And there were actually 3 words that could have gotten this response from ATC at the time, and those were emergency, mayday, and also pan. At this point, the Avianca crew were within rights to use any of those terms, and if they had, well then the outcome of the story might have been very different. But instead, the crew now kept waiting past their expected further clearance time until time 2044, when the New York ARTCC transmitted a new EFC time of 21:05. At this point, the pilots must have realized that if they didn't get any further clearances before time 21:05, they might actually run out of fuel even before reaching the airport. So, in response to this new EFC, the first officer now transmitted, well, I think we need priority. Now I want to pause here for a second and discuss the use of this word, priority. You see, priority does confer a sense of urgency, but in general, controllers would assume that if the situation was an actual emergency, well then the pilots would instead use one of those three words that I mentioned before. This meant that if you requested priority, you might receive some favorable treatment, but the controller probably wouldn't drop everything to get you to the runway as fast as physically possible. But Boeing documents related to fuel management on the 707 actually advised the pilots to request priority from air traffic control whenever they were operating with low fuel. And other Avianca pilots testified that their colleagues who had undergone training directly with Boeing, which included the first officer of this flight, came away with the impression that the word priority in a low fuel situation would result in the same air traffic control behavior as the word emergency. Now this is super important to understand because it actually explains a lot of what happened next here. In response to the first officer's request for priority, the New York ARTCC controller now asked, how long can you hold and what is your alternate? The first officer responded, yes sir, we're able to hold about 5 minutes, that's all we can do. Now what he meant here was likely that if they didn't start their approach in the next 5 minutes, they would not have enough fuel to reach the runway, but that's not exactly what he said. In response to that, the controller asked, what's your alternate? To which the first officer replied, we said Boston, but it's full of traffic, I think. The controller asked him to repeat that last message, and the first officer then said, it was Boston, but we can't do it now. We run out of fuel now. As this was happening in the ARTCC facility, a handoff controller, whose job it was to arrange handoffs between the ARTCC and the TRACON, had heard the first officer's request for priority and immediately called to ask the TRACON if they could take Flight 052 in. Now, while his colleague continued speaking with the first officer, the handoff controller said to the TRACON, Avianca 052, just coming off Cameron, can only do 5 more minutes in the hold. Think you'll be able to take him in, or should I set him up for his alternate? And in a tragic coincidence, he didn't hear the first officer say that he could no longer reach Boston, since he had already shifted his attention over to calling the TRACON at that point. As a result, the handoff controller assumed that when the first officer said that they could only do 5 more minutes in the hold, he had meant that after 5 minutes they would have to divert to their alternate, when he had actually meant that if they held for more than 5 minutes, they might not even reach JFK. And then, in a second critical miscommunication, the handoff controller didn't advise the TRACON that Flight 052 had requested priority. Because of all of this, the crucial knowledge that Flight 052 could not reach its alternate was now completely lost in the transfer. Less than a minute later, the New York ARTCC cleared Flight 052 to exit the holding pattern and to contact the TRACON, and within moments later they were out of the holding and proceeding in the direction towards JFK. This likely convinced the pilots that they were now being given priority, when in reality they actually weren't. In fact, the TRACON controller had simply decided to take Avianca next, and he didn't think any further special action was actually needed beyond that. And that misunderstanding was also tested just a few minutes later, shortly after the start of the cockpit voice recording. You see, because Flight 052 had been taken out of the holding early, they didn't have the appropriate separation from the aircraft ahead. So at time 2054, the TRACON instructed them to turn right heading 220, I'm gonna have to spin you, sir. And that was for all practical purposes another holding pattern. Now, if Flight 052 had declared an emergency, the controller would have obviously ordered other planes out of the way instead of giving them an orbit at this point. So this should have been a clear evidence to the pilots that they were not receiving the type of assistance that they needed. But instead of protesting, they just accepted it without any further questions or calls. Now it has to be noted here that the captain either couldn't understand the controller's transmissions due to a language barrier, or he wasn't wearing his headset, or something else, because the first officer had to repeat every single instruction back to him. So in this case, the first officer simply gave him the heading that they had been cleared for without explaining what the controller was actually doing or why. And with the autopilot inoperative, the captain would have been hand flying, which probably required the majority of his attention. You see, the autopilot is a workload reducing device, and when you don't have it, the extra workload of flying the plane displaces the ability to direct attention towards other topics, like analyzing the air traffic control and fuel situation, or listening to transmissions in a foreign language. So in this case, the captain simply flew the plane through this orbit as though there was nothing else that he could do about it. Now that maneuver cost Flight 052 about 6 minutes, which, if you recall, was longer than the pilots said that they could hold for. Now, if the ARTCC had told them to wait for 6 minutes, they might have said no, but now they likely believed that they were being given priority handling, because they must have somehow rationalized that this was the fastest way to get to the runway, even though it obviously wasn't. Anyway, during the orbit, the controller also gave them some more bad news. There was wind shear reported on approach, with a 10-knot change in wind speed at 1500 feet and then again at 500 feet. In the cockpit, the captain now asked, "What is he saying? Wind shear?" To which the first officer replied by repeating the controller's transmission in Spanish. After the controller had told them about the wind shear, the pilots tuned into the automatic terminal information system to copy the latest weather. And that indicated that there was now an indefinite cloud ceiling at 200 feet, visibility of 1/4 of a mile, light drizzle and fog, and winds out of the southwest at 17 knots. So basically, dreadful conditions in which a successful landing was definitely not guaranteed. The pilots were well aware of their dire fuel situation at this point, because the cockpit voice recorder now captured the flight engineer reading out the abnormal procedures for flight with less than 1,000 pounds of fuel in each of the 4 main tanks. You see, when the tanks are nearly empty, changing pitch too sharply can cause the fuel to slosh away from the fuel pump inlets, resulting in engine flameout, so the crew had to be careful here. By now, a mounting sense of dread was probably building up in the pilots' stomachs, and things were about to get much, much worse. For several minutes, Flight 052 now received normal handling, with progressive clearances to lower and lower altitudes, as well as vectors towards the final approach, just like any other plane in the landing sequence. During this time, the pilots still insisted to themselves that they were indeed being given special accommodation, as the first officer said, "They accommodate us." And the flight engineer stated, "They already know that we're in a bad condition." The first officer also attempted to reassure the captain by adding, "They are giving us priority." But in reality, they weren't. At time 21:11, the TRACON final controller cleared Flight 052 to intercept the ILS approach for runway 22 left, and then instructed them to contact the tower. Now, they soon successfully intercepted the localizer to align with the runway, and then started preparing to also intercept the glide slope. This would be the hardest part, because with no autopilot and no approach mode on the flight director, the captain would have to, like I mentioned earlier, fly the approach using only raw data instrumentation. With reported wind shear, low visibility, manual flight on raw data, and critically low fuel, this was almost certainly the most difficult approach that this captain had ever flown, and it was definitely the one with the highest stakes. Their fuel at this point was so low that if they didn't land on this first attempt, there was almost no chance that they could complete a second approach, so they had to get this approach right. Inside the cockpit, the captain continued having difficulty processing what his colleagues were saying, and at one point he even snapped at the first officer and told him, "Tell me things louder, because I'm not hearing it." And that was a clear sign that he was under extreme stress at this point. At time 21:18, Flight 052 finally began to intercept the glide slope, while the pilots progressively extended the flaps to their maximum setting of 50 degrees and also lowered the landing gear. It would later turn out that flap 50 actually wasn't allowed with the special hush kits that this 707 was equipped with due to noise, and the extra drag from this flap setting likely made the captain's job even harder. Ahead of them, another aircraft now encountered a significant wind shear, worse than what the controller had previously reported, but this information was never passed on. In the cockpit, the captain was trying to follow the glide slope, but he did so with a rate of descent that was too high, likely because of a 60-knot headwind that was causing them to have a lower ground speed than normal. And because of this, they now quickly began to descend below the glide slope. The first officer called out corrections, to which the captain ended up overcorrecting, which is very easy to do when you're flying raw data. Remember, he didn't have a flight director telling him how much he should be pitching up or down as he normally would. At time 21:20, Kennedy Tower cleared Avianca Flight 052 to land and reported that the wind was now 090 degrees at 20 knots. So, with that 60-knot headwind that they had at their current altitude, this meant that somewhere in the next few minutes they would experience a 40-knot decrease in wind, in what's known as a negative wind shear. A positive wind shear tends to increase the airspeed and lift the plane up, so a sudden loss of headwind would have the opposite effect, causing airspeed to decrease and the plane to descend instead. Continuing to monitor the instruments as they passed through 1,000 feet, the first officer repeatedly warned, slightly below glide slope, and the captain repeatedly responded by overcorrecting above and then back below the glide slope, obviously struggling to follow the raw data indications. Below glide slope, the first officer cautioned again, glide slope! And then suddenly, at time 21:22, the headwind decreased by 30 or 40 knots in a matter of seconds, causing the airplane to descend rapidly. "This is the wind shear," the first officer exclaimed, accompanied by the ground proximity warning system bursting into life, blaring out, "Glide slope!" "Whoa, up! Think rate!" 500 feet, the first officer then called out. They were now getting very low on the approach. A mile and a half short of the runway, they descended to only 200 feet above a residential neighborhood. The ground proximity warning sounded 13 separate times as the flight crew now desperately looked out, searching for the runway through the rain and fog. But with a cloud ceiling at 200 feet and only a quarter of a mile of visibility, they were unable to spot it. In the cockpit, there was now desperate shouting as the captain exclaimed, "The runway, where is it?" And the first officer repeatedly replying, "I don't see it, I don't see it." And it was at this moment that the captain came to the horrible realization that they wouldn't be able to land. He had no choice but to go around and hope for the best, so he now made the fateful call, "Give me gear up." At this point, Flight 052 only had about 10 minutes of fuel remaining, so even if they had immediately turned straight back to the outer marker and repeated the final approach, it was questionable if they could have made it. But if they wanted any chance of survival, they had to at least try to get that aircraft quickly onto the approach again, but that's not what happened. As the captain started to go around, he told the first officer to request another traffic pattern, while the flight engineer warned him to be smooth with the nose to prevent fuel slushing and engine flameouts. "Executing a missed approach, Avianca 052 Heavy," the first officer reported over the radio, and Kennedy Tower responded by instructing them to turn left onto an outbound heading and climb to 2,000 feet, which was the ILS intercept altitude. Hearing this transmission, the captain started to say, "We don't have fuel," but the first officer again simply read back the clearance and didn't protest any further. The captain continued by saying, "I don't know what happened with the runway. I didn't see it," and he then added, "Tell them we are in an emergency." Over the radio, the first officer now told Kennedy Tower, "We're running out of fuel," but he still didn't use the word emergency, and the tower controller also didn't ask for how much fuel they actually had left. The captain continued to insist, "Advise him we're in an emergency. Did you tell him?" To which the first officer replied, "Yes, sir, I have already advised him," which is the biggest indicator we have that the first officer believed his request for priority had really conveyed their emergency status to air traffic control. In fact though, until the first officer said, "We're running out of fuel," neither the TRACON nor the tower controller knew that Flight 052 had any problem with the fuel at all. As the aircraft continued through its outbound turn, the tower instructed them to contact the TRACON for resequencing, which is not at all what would have happened if the controller believed that they were in an actual emergency, by the way. And once again, the first officer simply complied with that request. Moments later, after the crew advised that they had made a missed approach, the TRACON controller instructed them to climb to 3,000 feet in order to get them back into the approach queue. The captain told the first officer to advise him we don't have fuel, But the first officer only acknowledged the instruction to climb whilst also adding, "We're running out of fuel, sir." Climbing to 3,000 feet would simply waste their fuel and throw away whatever slim chance that they still had, but yet the captain complied and they started climbing anyway. The controller now also said, "Avianca 052 Heavy, I'm going to bring you about 15 miles northeast and then turn you back into the approach. Is that fine with you and your fuel?" And before replying, the flight engineer commented that the controller sounded angry, and the first officer therefore meekly replied, "I guess so, thank you very much." And then, for a while after this, there was only silence in the cockpit. Now, in aviation, we have this concept of 5 hazardous attitudes: anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. And that last one, that's the one that I want to talk about here. Resignation is that feeling that there's nothing you can do anyway, so why even bother trying? Which is a real problem, because as a pilot, when you're in a nightmare scenario like this one, continuing to try as hard as you can is really the only thing that you can do. Now, I think that these pilots showed signs of resignation even well before the go-around, already when they started accepting instructions that made their fuel situation progressively worse, and actually even in the planning stage. Pilots need to make sure that they stay in control of events, instead of letting events control them, which is what this crew definitely did here. Just going with the flow and allowing things to happen to them. Sure, the captain was likely task saturated and they didn't have any CRM training, but that still doesn't explain why they stayed so relatively passive throughout this. At time 21:32, with the fuel gauges now reading near zero, Flight 052 began its base turn to intercept the localizer for a second approach. Seconds later, the fuel tanks began to run dry and the engines started shutting down one after another. Amid the sound of engine power rolling back, the flight engineer called out, flame out on engine 4, and then just seconds later he also added, "Flame out on engine 3, essential on number 2 and number 1. Knowing that the remaining engines would fail at any second, the captain now desperately called out, "Show me the runway!" But they were still 15 miles away from the airport at this point, out over the north shore of Long Island. Over the radio, the first officer now pleaded, "We just lost 2 engines and we need priority, please!" But, of course, it was now way too late. The controller gave them a final heading to intercept the localizer, and when the crew acknowledged, that was the last thing anyone heard from Avianca Flight 052. On board, the cockpit voice recorder captured the pilots setting up their instruments for the approach, but then the recording abruptly ended as engine 1 and 2 also ran out of fuel and flamed out, removing the last bit of electrical supply from the aircraft. With no engines or electrical power, the lights also went out as the sound of the engines died away and an eerie quiet fell over the doomed 707. Gliding down through the howling wind and rain, there was nothing that the pilots could do except for hoping that they would come down somewhere flat and open. But unfortunately, they didn't. At time 21:34, Avianca Flight 052 slammed nose first into a wooded hillside in the village of Cove Neck on Long Island, causing the fuselage to break into 3 pieces as the entire plane came to a sharp stop. The nose section was catapulted over a hilltop and through a backyard, while the main fuselage came to rest on a nearly 45-degree slope with its tail lying across a residential road. Inside the cabin, the extreme force of the impact caused the seats to buckle and rip out of the floor, sending passengers crashing into their surroundings with devastating results. Among the 158 passengers and crew, the crash ended up killing 73 people, including all 3 pilots and 5 of the 6 cabin crew. And out of the 85 survivors, all except for 2 infants were seriously hurt with multiple broken bones, severe head injuries and many other forms of trauma. But because there was no fuel, there also was no fire. In its final report, the National Transportation Safety Board determined that the cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to exercise adequate fuel management and their failure to convey the emergency situation to air traffic control. Contributing factors included the crew's failure to request updated information on the situation in the New York area, improper traffic flow management by the central flow control facility, and the high difficulty of the manual raw data approach in bad weather under stress. That prevented the crew from landing the plane on that first attempt. In the years that followed, the crash of Avianca Flight 052 became an important cause for safety improvements around the world, affecting several different areas of aviation. In addition to reforming the way that expect further clearances times are issued, air traffic controllers are now much more strongly encouraged to ask a flight crew for more information if they suspect that there might be an issue with the fuel. And the International Civil Aviation Organization established the first unified global testing standards for airmen's English in order to ensure that pilots from around the world could effectively communicate in the language of aviation. This crash, and also other crashes during that same time period, including the Kegworth air disaster, also led the FAA to implement new standards for airline seat design to ensure that the seats could withstand an impact of up to 16 Gs and stay in position even in the event of severe damage to the floor. And this accident also endures as a case study for us pilots on how the crew can let themselves fall into a situation from which there is no escape simply by making a series of passive, favorable assumptions about the situation. This tragedy is actually a great example of why we should always plan for contingencies and constantly assess and then reassess our options as we're faced with changing circumstances. And that actually is good advice for any situation in life, including for you guys as well. Now, I hope that you found this video interesting, and if you did, remember to subscribe and leave a comment. I love hearing from you. If you want to see my next video before anyone else, then please go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. Check this video out next. It's really cool. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.